Good evening, and welcome to this week's edition of Thinking Thursday. I'm your host, Bronwyn Lucas, and I look forward to our time together tonight. Now, tonight's topic, we're dealing with domestic violence because this is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. But I want you to know we're looking at it from just the whole abuse point of view, and our subtopic is abuse is more than hitting. And that's what we will talk about tonight. But we have to start off with our breathing. For those of you, if it's your first time, we start each week with some deep breaths. Deep breaths put more oxygen through your body, more oxygen flowing through your brain. It allows the body to relax. By the end of the day, many of us have gone through long and stressful days, and whether you're listening to the show or not, you need that moment to woosah. So we're going to take a few moments to do that. So you're going to breathe in to the count of 4. I'll be counting for you, and out to the count of 4. I will be counting slow, so I need you to breathe slow. So breathe in, 2, 3, 4, out, 2, 3, 4. In, 2, 3, 4, out, 2, 3, 4. And one more. In, 2, 3, 4, out, 2, 3, 4. Hopefully you had that woosah moment and you're a little relaxed and ready to listen to an interesting topic. And we have a special guest who I will introduce shortly. But I have to start off with a few relevant right now topics. If you have not completed the census, today is the last day to do so. Why complete the census? Over 600 billion, that's billion with a B, dollars of federal money is allocated to communities based on your completion of the census. If you want your community to get some of that $675 billion, you've got to complete the census. They have to have a real count, because if you have a community of 500 people and only 100 people complete the census, you know how much your community is going to be funded for? For 100, not 500. Those are just numbers to give you the example. So take the time, complete the census. It's important. And voting. Please vote early. Here in Texas, we have we have surpassed what they thought we would in early voting. It is there, so get out there. Yes, the lines are already there. So don't wait until Election Day. Who knows what will happen? Vote, vote, vote. I made it a point to get there early, and I voted on the first day. It's great. I stood outside. Well, I took my chair. I was prepared, and I'm glad I did, because I was early before the polls opened. I sat. It was cool. I was there. So let's get out there and vote. Tonight's topic is domestic violence. It is, as I said, it's Domestic Violence Awareness Month. When people think of domestic violence, they typically think of someone who is being physically abused, being hit. However, when you look at the larger context of abuse, just abusive relationships, it is so much more. Tonight, I really want to focus on emotional abuse. There are people who are in abusive relationships, emotionally abusive relationships, who have not even labeled as such. They don't even realize it. And as you listen tonight, you'll understand why. Because if you've never been in that situation or don't know anyone in that situation, you're like, how is somebody in an abusive relationship and they don't know? Well, they don't label it as abuse. It's a bad relationship, but not really seeing it as abuse. Tonight we have a guest. Her name is J. Leslie Crawford, and this is a cousin of mine. And she's been through an ordeal that she is going to share with us. She is a retired Army vet, 21 years in the Army, and she left as a Sergeant First Class. So she's got some great experiences, and she's going to share her story with us. Um, Not a good path, but she has come out on the other side, and she's healing and doing wonderful. So, Jamise,
Good evening.
how are you this
Bronwyn, can you
evening?
hear me okay?
Yes, can you hear me?
Oh, great. Yes, I
How
hear
are
you
you?
great. I'm doing fine.
And before you get
I
started, I forgot I like to remind everybody, take a moment and share. If you're watching on Facebook, all you have to do is look right below the screen and it's going to say there will be a share button. Please share. As I said, this is a topic a lot of people might need to hear. I got some calls today. It's like, oh, wow. I didn't think about it that way when I shared why we were looking at emotional abuse. So, share, you might be able to help someone just by letting them be a part of this conversation. And you'll have a chance. We'll be asking you some questions to drop in. So, get ready to please take a moment, hit that share button. Once you hit the share button, underneath, you'll have a chance to share it, and we invite you to do that. So, Jamise, how are you this
Yes,
evening?
me. I'm doing well. Thank you so much for asking. And even before we get started, Bronwyn, I just want to say thank you so very much for thinking of me and thinking of me enough to share on your podcast. I'm deeply honored, and I'm super excited to talk about an uncomfortable subject that we will be talking about through the month of October. So, again, thank you.
Well, thanks for being willing to share your story. There are a lot of people out there who are going through similar situations. So, before we get started, I want to share this, and Jamise, um, you can chime in. I want to just sort of explain what's called the cycle of violence. A lot of people don't even realize what it is, but there is a definite cycle. And I'll say this to anyone who recognizes themselves, you are not alone. If you were the only person going through it, it wouldn't have a name. We wouldn't even be able to call it a cycle. But I wanted to quickly go through this cycle. The first part is the honeymoon phase. That's where everything is wonderful, and it may have been you've already had some physical abuse, emotional abuse, and you're back in the. He says he's sorry, he loves you, and the woman feels hopeful or feels loved all over again, and oh, everything is wonderful and it's going to be good. But after that, you get some tension might build. And if it's a physically violent relationship, he'll show more and more anger, and you feel like that violence is going to happen. You can tell the tension's building, and you're walking on eggshells because you don't want it to happen again. And then how? It's the explosion. And in an emotionally abusive relationship, it's the same thing. It could be the name calling, and Jamise will talk more about this. It will be all of the negative behaviors, and then the woman is afraid. And she may feel physical pain, emotional pain, fear,
Yeah.
despair, humiliation. How could I let this happen to me again? And sometimes, even if your friends know, you don't want to tell them because you let it happen again. And the last stage is he'll make excuses, is denial. He'll make excuses, minimize what he did. Well, if you only didn't do this, and then the woman may take on the blame herself, and the cycle continues. The cycle can go over a long period of time or a short period of time, but the violence or the negative behavior gets worse. It is like, if you can take this much, you take a little more and a little more. The honeymoon phase may disappear. Then the denial phase may disappear, and it's just you're in a constant state of abuse. Before you even tell your story, Jamise, what do you know, or can you say about this cycle of violence that we've talked about?
I'm so glad you asked me that because I think it's one of the telltale signs that you're in an emotionally abusive relationship. And it's so interesting because I generally refer to this cycle as, or I've coined it as, the emotional roller coaster. And it's funny because I didn't know when I coined it the emotional roller coaster that this was the cycle of abuse. And I remember just vividly now, one afternoon, the first time I left my ex-husband, I was sitting on my couch and a friend had come by to check on me because he was very well aware of what I coined the emotional roller coaster. And I was telling him that I was tired and it was time for me to get off of that emotional roller coaster. And it's just a terrible place to be. It is a very low feeling. Once you recognize you're in this cycle, your head is spinning, thinking of ways of how to and get out successfully and be safe in the process. Because sometimes, especially if you are an individual that's not only experiencing the emotional abuse, you may also be experiencing the physical abuse, which can definitely be more variables that need to be covered as you're trying to exit out of the relationship.
So true. Tell us a little about your story. Um, I know that it was a emotionally abusive relationship, and again, thank you for sharing because it's difficult to bare your soul, but what you're sharing may help some others. So please tell us a little about your story and what has happened.
Okay, I definitely will. So, I was, like you are aware, and hopefully some of my friends and families have also chimed in the podcast. Some of my very close people in my social group are aware, but I was married for 20 years. I met my husband or my ex-husband in the military. We got married. I was 19 years old when we got married. So I was a babe myself. Um, and I think that's a lot of reasons why when I did decide to leave my relationship, why I struggled so much is because, in hindsight, I had never really been alone. I left the safety net of my mother and I joined the military, gained a family, a military family. And then I got married shortly thereafter, and I spent 20 years in a. And I want to be very careful not to speak ill about my ex-husband because I think even from an abusive perspective, they have some issues that they need to work out, and they may not even necessarily know that they have this pattern. And so I'm not giving him a pass, but at the same time, I don't want to use this platform to bash him.
Mm-hmm.
So, with that being said, I will say that we had a lot of great times together. Obviously, we were married for 20 years, but we also had some not so great times. Um, I did have a touch with physical abuse with him for a little while, but that's what subsided, and then shortly after that subsided, the emotional abuse began. I think for me, I was just so happy and that the physical abuse had ended, and to me, we were better, and to me, we could be a family,
How
and
early in your
we.
marriage was the physical abuse?
I'd like to say, let me see, geez, so I married in October of '98, and we had Brandon in 2000. So shortly after I had Brandon. So
Mm-hmm.
2 years into the relationship, 2 years into the marriage, um, I experienced some physical abuse. I experienced that physical abuse for about a year. When I eventually said enough is enough. If you want me, you have to treat me better. And we went to counseling, and we essentially got it together, or so I thought. And it just
Mm-hmm.
kind of escalated from there, from the physical abuse and then into the emotional abuse. It started so minute and so small, and so I think that I was very dismissive. So in terms of I would dismiss the behavior or chalk it up to some stressful event in our professional lives, and it just essentially snowballed.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting. You said you could chalk it up to something going on in your professional behavior. And when we think back to that cycle of violence, that's where the denial comes in. Well, see, it's not really him. He's not that bad. It's because, you give it other reasons and you're denying the real reason that it's going to do the real thing, that it is abuse. It's
Right.
easy because, most people don't want to say, oh, I'm in an abusive relationship. We don't want to
No, you
admit that,
don't.
and it takes a lot to do that. Tell us a little more about the just some of the things that made you realize it wasn't an emotionally abusive relationship.
To be completely honest, and I think this is like a perfect time to say that for me, it wasn't until I had been married maybe about 17 years, to be completely honest. I stayed in denial for a very long time, and I have many experiences that I blamed on other factors, or I made excuses, or I pretended. I buried my head in the sand, so to speak, and I pretended like it wasn't happening. Um, I also felt like I had an image to uphold. I believe that a lot of people believed in us, who looked to us as as a modeled relationship. It's funny because our son shared with me just here recently, like one of his struggles was he felt like his parents were Superwoman and Superman. So
Mm.
imagine that type of weight and why you want so badly for your relationship to work, because you feel like so many people are relying on that relationship to work. And you're choosing that over your own peace and sanity. But I also want to say this is whether you're in the relationship one day, 1 week, 1 year, or 20 years like me, it's never too early to get out, and it's never too late to get out.
And I
So
think that's so
definitely,
important. Say that one more time.
I said, if you are in a relationship one day, 1 week, 1 month, 1 year, or 20 years like myself, it's never too early to get out, and it's never too late to get out.
Let me ask you, in that 20-year relationship, um, did you ever experience any depression? You did talk about how you sort of just went on, you stayed, you were in denial. Was there any depression?
Oh, absolutely. I actually had a serious bout of depression. I actually entered depression. And what I want to say early stages, I don't even know if that's from a medical point of view, if that's even an accurate way to describe it. But I believe that I started to suffer from depression in early 2017. And it started very slow. I did have other factors going on in my life. And because I had gotten to a point where I felt like I didn't have a support network that would uphold me, or hold me up and, pour into me, or that I wasn't ashamed to even admit that I was experiencing the things that I was experiencing. So I held everything close to my heart. And then as a result, I started to eventually uh, kind of drift away from my friendships, kind of drift away from the organizations I belonged to. I found myself just doing just enough to get by, in terms of being there for my son, and making meals for him and showing up to his games, and allowing that representative to show up so people couldn't see how broken I was inside. And then through my divorce, well, actually through being diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and then being diagnosed with MGUS, and battling back from just the minor things, the disabilities that I developed through my illnesses, and not even having the support from my ex-husband. I could barely walk at times and was driving myself to physical therapy, and it was in one of those low moments, knowing that I was in this battle for my life alone, is when it really hit me the hardest. Um, And so I would find myself literally pulling over on the side of the road, breaking down, because I couldn't call home. I didn't have a friend I could call that I felt like could understand where I was, and could meet me in the place that I was. And I mean emotionally, I don't mean in the physical sense.
Right.
And so, again, like it was completely, now I look back on it, I just say, thank God that he has grace and mercy. And he saw fit for me to survive. He saw fit for me to stand firm, planted on both of my feet, and being the success story that I am. And even now today, I still struggle with that because it doesn't really feel like a lot of success, if you will. But yeah, so I think that it started very small and it just grew to the point where I was not getting out of bed for days at a time. I wasn't taking baths for days at a time. I wasn't even going out for fresh air. And then when I eventually tried to pull myself together, because other people started coming and like, where you been? What's going on with you? We haven't seen you. So I started to pull myself together for that. To show up occasionally, it was very difficult. It was very difficult for me.
When you think about what you're going through, I want to just bring in a little bit. I want to comment on some of the things you said. One of the things I want to make sure our audience really gets that you went through during the course of your marriage, you found out you had several major health challenges. And that's what she was saying. And can you tell us just a little bit so they understand what was going on health-wise with you as your marriage was finally coming to an end and how that relates, how that's emotionally abusive, what was going on with you physically and how it impacted you emotionally. And before you say that, the reason I want her to really stress this, I say on this podcast that our mental health and our physical health are intertwined. If you are not well emotionally, it can impact you physically because as she described her depression, once you're so depressed, you're not eating, you're not sleeping, that can have an impact on your life. When you have a lot of physical things going on, it can impact you emotionally and cause depression. So we can't separate our physical and emotional health. It's one and the same. They feed off each other. So let the audience know what was going on with you physically, and about where that was in your marriage when you found out you had these major health challenges.
So at the end of 2017, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. I don't know if the audience is familiar with multiple sclerosis, but it is a neurological autoimmune disorder. And I woke up one morning in crisis. This was the second time, or maybe the third time that I woke up in a crisis like this. But there are several markers that you have to hit before you're actually diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. Essentially, I woke up and my left side was completely numb. I obviously went to the emergency room, and then thereafter I had a series of exams. I eventually left there and met with my neurologist, and I had been seeing my neurologist for about a year, about actually a couple of years on and off, battling just the neurological parts that were being attacked in my body from the condition before I was actually diagnosed. After I was officially diagnosed, one of the biggest, hurdles was I began, it is just like, any other condition. So you definitely go through a lot of emotions. And my biggest fear was everyone that I knew of, famous or not, struggle with the possibility of being wheelchair bound. And here I was at that time. I had been in the Army 18 years, and here I was just wanting. And it's so silly because I cared more about making it across the finish line in my mind was 20 years in the military, and so I would pray, God, just keep me whole long enough to retire, and that to me was the finish line. And it became so much more than that, because in the course of being diagnosed and being in crisis and being hospitalized, I definitely went through times where I couldn't physically walk. I went through times where I suffered a traumatic brain injury as a result of having multiple sclerosis, because I was, one, suffering from incontinence, and two, to make a long story short, I was going from one meeting to another meeting, ran to my office to get a piece of fruit, and then was going to run down a couple flights of stairs to get to my next meeting. Well, in the building that I worked in, the stairs are concrete stairs with metal wrought iron siding. And I went into crisis going down the stairs. So, and crisis for me looks like where one part of my body is working, the other part is not. So when I lifted and shifted my weight to work my legs, one half of my body was no longer working, but unfortunately my weight had already shifted. So I tumbled down 3 flights of concrete stairs, banging my head on the concrete and on the wrought iron, and I suffered a traumatic brain injury. I was hospitalized. From that situation, I essentially had to go to physical therapy, occupational therapy, and also speech therapy, because I suffered another injury where they call, I guess the medical term is word finding. So I had to really learn how to speak again, walk again, do normal tasks. And I went through this therapy essentially by myself. My ex-husband was always too busy or always had another commitment. And then the funny thing is when I look back on it, actually, I sometimes cry when I look back on it, because I was so busy making excuses. But the truth is you're suffering, and even in a minute situation, your spouse is your rock. That person should always be there. And so I felt like, I experienced emotional abuse in so many ways during that time period, because one, he was lying to me, which is a form of emotional abuse. I was socially isolated. He made me socially isolated, because I could never really do things without him, or he would deter me from hanging out with friends. So I would just decide to stay home. And so, the bonds that I once had, they were slowly slipping away. So I had become socially isolated. He would excessively criticize me about me feeling sorry for myself. Or if I'm crying, he would say that he couldn't allow himself to get down because he needed to stay happy for us. Meanwhile, he was in an extramarital affair and could care less about the fact that, I was facing so many things. Yet he was always so knowledgeable, which is so funny. But when I look back on it, being over familiar with a situation is one of those types of emotional abuse. So he could always out-talk me or over-talk me. And so I experienced so many different things in that context, which brings me to the point is shortly thereafter, while I was in full therapy, I had a set of blood work done, and that blood work came back with a double protein. And funny thing is I was so focused on with the idea or the mindset that I could beat MS, which if anyone knows anything about multiple sclerosis, there is no cure. There are only medications to slow the progression of the disease. And so to make a long story short, my neurologist referred me to a a hematology oncologist. I just said hemoc because that's the short version of that long term. So it never dawned on me that my neurologist thought that I had cancer. It just never dawned on me. It wasn't until I actually went to the hemoc appointment, met with the hemoc doctor, and as I was passing through to do my vitals, I could see people getting chemotherapy. And like they had a special room and a special place for you to pick out head coverings. And, I was I was even clueless when I was sitting in the waiting room. So you could tell that just even from what I was going through, I was really so removed from reality. And so I literally realized that my double protein was in fact a precursor for multiple myeloma, and I was actually on the spectrum. And so it's funny because your sister, whom I love dearly, who has gone on to glory, was my rock during that time, because not often do you find a person who could have multiple myeloma and multiple sclerosis at the same time. And so, and to do that and be in an emotionally abusive marriage, it just broke me, literally, to the point where I had begun to become very ill. And I was in the hospital, and my doctor said, your relationship is so toxic, it's killing me. And if you don't get out, you're never going to get better. And I honestly believe that if that doctor had not said that to me, I would still be in that emotionally toxic, abusive relationship. But I wanted to live.
That speaks to how important, that speaks to the relationship between our emotion and our physical health. As you described, everything going on physically with you, had you been in a healthier relationship, you're right. It would have been easier, definitely, just to have had the support. But you're right, it may even impact how you handle the disease. As you stated, the doctor said your relationship is killing you. I applaud you, though, at that point in saying, I've got to go. Because there's some, and it's nothing, I'm not meaning this demeaning to those, but there's some who, even at that, don't leave because you're not emotionally ready. You have to really be emotionally ready to walk away from a relationship, no matter how negative it is. You found that point. So I wanted to just interrupt to applaud you. Because there are others out there who are in the same state you're in, that you were in. I wanted to go back and highlight something you said, because I had a conversation earlier today with someone who went through something similar in terms of the isolation. And let me say, in the last year or so, I've had the opportunity, and yes, I say opportunity, to work with people who have been in domestic violence relationship or abusive relationship. And it was something I hadn't done before and a lot in my practice, but because of a contract I had daily, I was, speaking with someone in this type of relationship at various levels of emotional and physical abuse. And one thing that is common is the isolation. And you just talked about it. You said how, he kind of kept you isolated, and then he was the authority and you didn't want to tell anybody. So the isolation can come in two ways. One, the abuser can purposely isolate you, or you can isolate yourself, number two, because you don't want people to realize what you're going through. If they get too close, they'll realize that people often blame the abused person. I don't want to use the term victim.
Yes.
I want to just say the abused person. Well, why are you staying there with him? Girl, if that was me, I'd be gone. He crazy. why you let him treat you like that? And all of this happens, and the abused person becomes victimized again because they can't get the support, because people don't understand why you would stay. They don't understand that sometimes you feel trapped. You feel like you have to do it. And even the getting out process is difficult for people who are in physically abusive relationships and even emotionally abusive relationships. You may feel like he will kill me if I get out. And I have worked with people who, yes, that was the case, where, yeah, he did try to run you over or things like that because you tried to get out. Or emotionally, you are so bruised and battered, the idea of getting out just becomes difficult because what do I do now?
It was difficult.
So
it was
tell
very
me, yeah,
difficult.
kind of switch to, we have probably about 8 minutes left. Time has gone
Oh,
quickly.
wow.
Yeah. So tell me a little about your getting out. How was that for you?
So we have 8 minutes, but I will say this:
No,
it was
11
one
minutes. I
of
was
the.
wrong. Okay, go on.
11 minutes. Okay, good. It was one of the most difficult things I've ever had to do. And I did 21 years in the Army, so I would not compare even my year in Afghanistan at war worse than getting out of my marriage. And you might say, and people who are listening might say, that's an over-exaggeration, but let me tell you, it is not. I had to strategically plan to have my ex-husband served in a bank, in a public place, because I was afraid he was going to attack me. And I never forget when I spoke to the server that morning. He said, whatever happens, keep walking, don't look back. I promise you, when I exited the bank when he was being served, I sprinted to my car as fast as I could. And by the time I got to the door, he was right behind me. He attempted to attack me in the bank parking lot with cameras all the way around, people standing outside. I was used to being humiliated because I had already experienced humiliation in our marriage, just from emotional abuse. So I wasn't so much worried about being embarrassed or humiliated. I feared for my life. I literally was screaming to the top of my lungs. It was one of the scariest things I ever had to do. And then just getting completely out, and I left with nothing, literally. I left with not a dime in the bank, not a dime in my pocket, but I knew I needed to get out. And I just thank God for my best friend and her husband. They came through. They supported me. You'll just be surprised when you get beat down and battered and your abuser makes you believe you don't have a support system doesn't exist, that you need him or you need her to survive. You'd be surprised that when you finally break the chains and you attempt to free yourself from the relationship, the people who really love you, they show up and they show out. My best friend, she came. Her husband came. My sister came. My brother came. My mother came. And so I had just a circle of love around me. Now, they could not identify with my emotions, but they could definitely be there to support me financially, to support me physically, to make sure I had myself and my son, that we had everything we needed to survive. And then I had to do the work. And so I would tell anybody who is exiting out of an abusive relationship, one of the very first things that they should do is what I did: get a therapist. And I know oftentimes people feel like we don't do that, or they have their hang-ups. But I'm telling you that I could be raw with my therapist, and my therapist could give me the best advice and walk me through the grieving process of my relationship, help me prioritize my life, help me work through my sleep issues, which I have been divorced now for 2 years. I still have sleep issues. So I'm still working those areas of my life that have been completely I don't want to say completely, but that have been damaged by being in an abusive relationship. You know, some things are coupled with my condition and being a veteran. So, I mean, I get it, but I also attribute some of those things to being in an abusive relationship. You know, so that person helped me pour into myself and believe in myself, you know, and know my worth. And I don't think that if I hadn't got a therapist, that I could be able to do this, even be here today speaking about the process and speaking about my own or telling my own story. Because I was just that low. And so I would say get a therapist and get you a great support system. And when you get that support system, lean on them, you know, and let them love you and let them help you. Recognize just different areas in your life and be honest with yourself. If you know you need to do the work, do the work. And I will say this too, because I in the beginning I just wanted the grieving process to be over so bad. I'm 2 years post marriage into my divorce, and I'm still in the grieving process. I'm still working on myself. I'm still figuring things out. I'm still trying to believe in myself and see my potential and see my worth. It just doesn't happen overnight.
And you know, I'm so glad you use the term grieving process. It is your, even though it was such a negative relationship, it's a grieving process in terms of you're just grieving the whole life that you had, not that you want it back. You're in grief because of what it was. I want to take a moment just to say thank you for being so open and being so vulnerable. Your story, your ability to share is going to help somebody. So those of you who are on, if you haven't shared it, share this podcast, share this Facebook Live. It will be on YouTube. Those of you who have friends who are not on Facebook and won't be able to see it, they can go to YouTube and type in Thinking Thursday with Bronwyn and it will come up. Share it. There are people who can be helped by hearing her story. It is so important. I want to say a few things. It's so important what you said is that you had to realize your self-worth. If you are under the sound of my voice, as they say, and this story resonates with you because it's part of what you're going through, you are worth more than to be abused. You're not at fault for remaining in an abusive relationship. It's never too late, as she said in the beginning. It's never too late or too early to say enough is enough. I'm getting out. So take care of yourself and do what you need to do for you so that you can move forward because you were created for something better. We are going to talk about domestic violence again in 2 weeks from the point of view of an abuser. Now, I'm sure some of you are saying, what? Why do we need to hear that? But I want us to understand all sides of this. So I have someone who's coming on and he's going to talk about why he was an abuser, how God changed him, but how it's really a part of who he is. And it's just interesting. We need to understand, not to defend any abuser, but to understand what, put a person in that light. I always like to close with our call to action. And the first point tonight is if you have not completed the census, then you have until midnight to do it. Vote early, but first become an educated voter. Everything that's on that ballot impacts your life. So please, you can go to the League of Women Voters. I'll post it again, their link, and you can get the voter's guide. It will tell you what each candidate, they ask each candidate the same question so you can read the answers and become an educated voter. During this election cycle, do something tangible to promote your candidate. If you believe in somebody, promote them. Do something tangible to promote just voting early. Please don't wait till the last day. This has been one of the most unusual voting seasons. Well, 2020 has been one of the most unusual years. So please, please, please vote early. And lastly, ladies, if you have not had a mammogram and don't have insurance, October is the time to get one. You used to see more mobile units out, but look, Google it. Find out in your area. There are still places that are doing free mammograms during the month of October. Get that mammogram. It could save your life. Janice, I want to thank you so much for being vulnerable, being open, being willing to share your story because it is very difficult. Um, but it is so needed. And I know it was difficult. I heard the tears in your voice, but thank you again for being willing to just say, hey, this is my story. And I know that you were able to help someone just by being on tonight. So I truly, truly appreciate that. And as always, I like to say mental health is our health. And you can hear it tonight, how her mental and her physical are so intertwined. But before I close up, do you have any final comments you wanted to make?
I just want to say again, thank you so much for having me on. And I just want to encourage anyone who is experiencing domestic violence, emotional abuse, or physical abuse, get help. Get help, tell someone, and exit that situation as safely and as quickly as you possibly can, and know that you are not alone.
You are not. And as she said, you can get help. She talked a lot about, seeing a therapist. I am a therapist. I do work with people who have been in domestic violence relationships, people who have been harmed emotionally even more than physically, people that have been harmed physically that have a life that won't go away, some of the physical scars or emotional scars. If this is you or you know someone who is involved in this type of relationship, reach out. My number is 682-272-3949, or you can Google Able Counseling and Consulting. I currently do teletherapy only. COVID has changed the way I operate, but we can still talk. So reach out. And again, your health is your health. Mental health is just your health. So join us next week for another episode of Thinking Thursday. And again, you can go to YouTube or your podcast channels and you will be there. So we look forward to seeing you next week. Goodbye and good mental health.